I'm not sure what your question is.
You guys have
Why
spent
are
a
people
lot of
leaving
time-
Cuba, or what is the process for them getting here? I can explain either of them, but you tell me.
Sure, yeah. Do you think that people are leaving Cuba because they don't like communism?
I think we've been pretty clear that we think people are leaving Cuba, or not leaving Cuba, or protesting in the streets all as well, because they are opposed to the oppression, to the mismanagement of the government in the country. And we certainly support their right to protest. We support their efforts to speak out against their treatment in Cuba.
As Cubans have been protesting in the streets for days, the media, Twitter, and even Biden's administration have not been able to point out the simple facts that people are protesting against communism and their government. In the first clip, a journalist asked Jen Psaki if she thinks the reason why Cubans are leaving Cuba is because of communism, and if you actually know what's happening in Cuba, it's very clear to see that that's the reason. But her answer kind of makes it, to me, makes it feel like she's trying to defend the concept of communism. Like every good communist, saying, "Oh, but real communism's never been tried. It's not communism's fault. It's just this government and this government's mismanagement and this government's oppression. But if they actually had real communism, it wouldn't be a problem." So I think it's really disingenuous that she doesn't categorically point out that it's communism that's the problem, and instead she attacks this particular instance of it where she's saying that it's been mismanaged. This is the woman who's speaking for the free world. She should be very openly tough on communism. Communism is completely opposed to the mindset and the freedoms that we have in the West, and so it must be opposed. And it's shocking that Jen Psaki can't come out and say that communism is bad. I've got another clip as well to reinforce that she, again, can't say it. She was asked twice by the same journalist over 2 days or 3 days, and she couldn't come out and say it. So maybe I'll show you the second clip now.
And then on Cuba, you're talking today about how some of these protests are inspired by people exhausted with the government. Why is it that yesterday the State Department was saying that this was all happening out of concern about rising COVID cases?
Well, I would say first that the protests were just happening yesterday. We're still assessing what is motivating and, of course, and driving all of the individuals who came to the streets. But we know that when we say exhaustion, the manner by which the people of Cuba are governed, that can cover a range of issues, whether it's economic suppression, media suppression, lack of access to health and medical supplies, including vaccines. There are a range of reasons and voices we're hearing from people on the ground who are protesting.
So when these protesters are yelling freedom and enough, there are people within the administration who think they're saying freedom from rising COVID cases.
Again, I would say that when people are out there in the streets protesting and complaining about the lack of access to economic prosperity, to the medical supplies they need, to a life they deserve to live, that can take on a range of meanings. There's a global pandemic right now. Most people in that country don't have access to vaccines. That certainly is something we'd love to help with.
So yeah, apparently people shouting for freedom in the streets is not a good indicator that they want freedom, and instead could mean that they're very upset with COVID cases, which Jen Psaki once again reminds us that we're in a global pandemic. Yeah, she also listed like all the symptoms of communism, like economic suppression, media suppression, and no access to resources. But when the journalist questioned her on whether some people in the White House think that the reason why people are shouting freedom is because of COVID, she didn't deny it. So it's just very weird that with such an obvious reason to protest, the White House doesn't have a clear understanding of that reason. Now, somebody else who has had a real mask-off moment recently is AOC, because on this topic, she decided to come out against America and pro-communism for some reason. She's attacking the US embargo on Cuba, saying that this act of not trading with a communist country is cruelty, and that cruelty should not be used against people. So let's just look at the clip. She says it better than me.
And what's extraordinarily important for us to communicate as well is the actions and U.S. contributions to the suffering of Cubans on the island as well.
So it's the US contributions that are causing suffering and not the regime, which kidnaps, abducts, murders, silences, denies internet recently, starves its people. That's not cruelty, that's not oppression. It's the US which is responsible for this oppression.
There is no way where it is acceptable for us to use cruelty as a point of leverage against everyday people, period.
So once again, it's not the US which is being cruel to the Cuban people, it's the Cuban dictatorship, the Cuban regime, which is attacking its own people. They're the people being cruel. And on top of that, this argument just sounds like a very Cuba is Americans' business kind of argument, where America is responsible for Cuba. That's the vibe I get from it.
Whether it's our border or whether it's the US embargo on Cuba, the cruelty is the point.
So apparently the embargo itself on Cuba is cruel. So yeah, when a communist country can't be self-sufficient and it needs a capitalist country's trade, then that's a pretty big damnation of communism, I would say. And the US is under no obligation to trade anything with them. Why would you support a communist country? Now, coming back to the cruelty that AOC was talking about, apparently it's cruel to have an embargo on the US, but for any Cubans who decide to flee to the US, fleeing from communism, right? That, if you take to the sea, you will not come to the US. That is the DHS chief's position on that, so it's a bit of a double standard, isn't it? When you have thousands of people pouring through the Mexican border, but people who are fleeing genuine communism, what, they can just get fucked? I mean, it's ridiculous. It makes me wonder why they're denying people that come from Cuba, but not people who just come from South America and Mexico. It's probably got something to do with how they would vote, in my opinion. Furthermore, we have Twitter, who's also getting involved with telling us what's happening in Cuba. So here we can see that trending in the United States, SOS Cuba, people are helping to spread awareness on the impact of COVID-19 in Cuba as cases hit all-time high in the country. That is apparently what people are protesting about. But I can tell you, if you go and look up SOS Cuba on Twitter, you will not find anything, well, you might find some things about COVID, but most things are about the uprisings and protests in the street, where they often have videos of police brutality and all sorts of things that are happening in Cuba that are not to do with COVID. They are to do with people trying to stand up for their freedoms and overthrow a communist dictatorship. Here we have our favourite organisation, Black Lives Matter, who has also once again come out on the side of the communists. Let me read you their tweet. So, Black Lives Matter condemns the US federal government's inhumane treatment of Cubans. Once again, this is ridiculous. The Cuban dictatorship is the one that's mistreating Cuban people, not the US. The US has nothing to do with Cuba. And urges it to immediately lift the economic embargo. Yes, because that's what's being so cruel. This cruel and inhumane policy, instituted with the explicit intention of destabilizing the country and undermining Cubans' right to choose their own government. How rich! The right to choose their own government. Ridiculous. Is at the heart of Cuba's current crisis. Since 1962, the United States has forced pain and suffering on the people of Cuba by cutting off food, medicine and supplies, costing the tiny island nation an estimate of $130 billion. Why does the US need to trade with a communist country? Why are they obligated to? To be honest, I'd be very pleased if they stopped trading with China too, with all the slave labour that's going on over there and the gross human rights violations. I mean, we need to stand up for our morals, really. And anyway, Black Lives Matter, on the side of the communists. Without that money, it is harder for Cuba to acquire medical equipment needed to develop its own COVID-19 vaccines and equipment for food production. This comes in spite of the country's strong medical care and history of lending doctors and nurses to disasters around the world. It goes on, the people of Cuba are being punished by the US government because the country has maintained its commitment to sovereignty and self-determination. United States leaders have tried to crush this revolution for decades. Instead of international amity, respect and goodwill, the US government has only instigated suffering for the country's 11 million people, of which 4 million are black and brown. Yeah, got to make it about race. We've got to point out who's black. Cuba has historically demonstrated solidarity with oppressed peoples of Africa, of African descent, from protecting black revolutionaries like Assata Shakur through granting her asylum. I'm pretty sure this is a woman who shot a policeman and then ran away to Cuba, to supporting black liberation struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau and South Africa. Now we look to President Biden to end the embargo, something Barack Obama called for in 2016. This embargo is a blatant human rights violation and it must come to an end. Beautiful. Denying communists the right to trade, so denying communists the access to capitalism, is a human rights violation. I love it. And then this is another tweet from Black Lives Matter, this was in 2016. More support of communism here, rest in power, Fidel Castro, very nice. And the last thing I want to bring to people's attention is that the media have been, well, it's more in line with the Twitter thing, where Twitter is telling us that this is about COVID. And we've got similar things in the news where Cuba battles highest COVID-19 caseload in Latin America. And basically, I feel like the focus, there's a lot of news which is trying to bring attention to COVID as opposed to the communism. Cuba gripped by unrest battles highest COVID caseload in the Americas. Cubans take to streets in rare protests over lack of freedoms and worsening economy. And then the first thing says, thousands of Cubans took to the streets on Sunday to protest the lack of food and medicine as the country undergoes a grave economic crisis aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, it has to be about COVID. I feel like a lot of media is trying to tell us that this has been sparked by COVID, and that there may be an element of truth to that, but the underlying reason why people are standing up for their rights is not because of COVID, it's because of communism. So I hope you learned something from this video, and if you did, then please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to me, and yeah, I'll see you in a future video.